Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Chris Stafford, and my guest today is English journalist Rebecca Lowe, who set off on a cross-country bike ride with a difference in July 2015. Having specialised in writing about human rights, justice and the law in the Middle East, she determined it was time to travel those dusty roads, to breathe the air and feel the political and cultural pulse of the region for herself. For 9 months, she would traverse 20 countries across 3 continents, clocking up 6,835 miles, or 11,000 kilometres. Part of her motivation was, quote, to tell stories through the lens of people rather than politics, to shun the abstract for the specific, the exceptional for the commonplace, to bring humans back into the debate. She believed that the media is too often a distorting lens, picking the worst and making it the whole, and this was her chance to witness and share firsthand how everyday people shared the common necessities of life, regardless of their cultural differences, and prove that the world is a kindlier place than it seems. From being rescued after a flat tyre and offered tripe soup and a pint of Johnny Walker, to being smuggled into a Syrian refugee camp in Bulgaria, Rebecca captured every memory and image which she plans to convey in a book. In the meanwhile, the trip has inspired her to consider more intrepid adventures and become an activist for women's rights. Rebecca, welcome to the programme.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I know it's been a little while since you got back from this trip, so we want to reflect on it now that it's in your rear view mirror. What was that impacted you most of all, and how has it changed your perspective or your direction professionally and personally?
I think for me, there are the travel cliches of how friendly and wonderful everyone is when you're traveling. And that was one of my key takeaways. I did to a degree expect it, but actually being on the road and going to these places that do have a certain reputation of being dangerous, unsafe, difficult for women, and really not experiencing that many problems, and actually, on the contrary, experiencing just such warm humanity and such care and concern about me, and actually not really feeling that unsafe very much at all on the road. A few occasions that got a little bit hairy, but generally it was a very positive experience. And I think coming out of that and feeling to a degree sort of vindicated in my belief that I would have been safe on the road, despite what some people did think about the trip. I think that was for me just a wonderful thing to experience, and something that has changed me, and I think also made me, I hope, perhaps a more compassionate and empathetic person. That's not really for me to say, that's probably for others to say, but I do feel that I owe a lot to the people that I met and who made my journey very rewarding, fulfilling, safe and secure. And I feel that it's probably a debt I'm not ever really going to be able to repay. So that was perhaps my main takeaway from the journey. I don't know, did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Because of your background, Rebecca, you've been a journalist now for a number of years. You've specialised in human rights and the law and justice, and you've been reporting on that area of the Middle East where you travel to with somewhat intimate knowledge, but not boots on the ground. And it was that perspective you were looking for. And I'm just wondered if it told you the truth when you got there, a truth that you were not aware of.
Yes, you're right. So what I did know was the politics of the region. I knew something about the society. I knew something about the human rights and the legal situation in these countries, and I'd reported on them fairly extensively, and I'd done my research. But as you say, it's not until you get your boots on the ground that you really know what these places are like. And some of them were very much an unknown quantity, because I was trying to gauge, how safe certain areas would be going in alone as a woman. And actually, it was very hard to get that information because not that many people have done it. And so you are slightly going into the unknown. in some of these places, and certainly I think there were a couple of main preconceptions that the Western world and I also had about the region, which is that one is associated with women's rights and this idea that these are that some of these societies are perhaps they're very patriarchal, and there's a certain degree of misogyny, which is across the world as a whole. But that some communities perhaps worse than others in that respect. The other one was to do with extremist ideologies, it is of Islamism and terrorist sympathies. And I think I went along with both these ideas at the back of my head. What was I going to find when I spoke to a lot of people? And I tried to have as many conversations as I could with as many people as I could. And what I found was that regarding the sort of extremist sympathies and the Islamism, really I didn't find any evidence of that at all. Like with many, I spoke to everyone that I could about this, and not one Muslim that I spoke to even had any hint of sympathy with any of the jihadist groups, the extremist groups, the fundamentalist groups that we see in the media all the time. So that for me was interesting. Where women's rights was concerned, I think that is a big problem in the region. It's a big problem across the world. And there are particular areas that it's more of a problem than others. And I think in a way I came out feeling that actually it was perhaps a bigger issue than I'd really realized, and that I came out feeling very galvanized to try and do what I could to change the situation, perhaps more of a vehement feminist than I had been when I went in, because there are certain areas where women really have very few rights at all. They certainly do not have any rights to ride a bicycle, which is, I think, a great symbol of freedom and a great symbol of equality and liberation. And I think to get more women riding bicycles in some of these communities would be fantastic, and maybe could be a stepping stone to more greater economic, political and social rights down the line.
Did it also inform you in a way about women's rights that you actually now want to be an activist? You talk about being a feminist, but has it inspired you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise thought of doing because of your more distant perspective as a journalist, having been there, been immersed in it, and as you say, the women in the street that you've been dealing with, there's people that are not extremists. These are everyday people getting on with their lives, and you're seeing the real issues that are affecting them and that are important to them. Was that something you took away, say, I really could help, and this is how I could help? Or as a journalist, how I could help to educate and inform better?
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I had these ideas before, but in a very abstract and detached way. It's hard when you're writing about these issues from a cozy office in London, I think, to really to really empathize with these people. And being out there on the ground, I certainly felt more of a connection, and I've certainly come away wanting to be more of an activist rather than just a passive feminist. Absolutely. I haven't quite decided how I'm going to put that into practice yet, but it's something that I am 100% passionate about and determined to do. And it's very difficult as an outsider, as a Western woman, I think, sometimes going into other communities and trying to kind of impose your will or try and change society in very fundamental ways, because I don't think we necessarily should do that or are able to do that. But I certainly think a degree of support is very important, and to raise awareness about these women's issues in these areas. To perhaps, and there are some women doing some fantastic things in Afghanistan. A woman, Shannon Gilpin, is doing some wonderful work out there with women cyclists at Now, I think that they have a women's cyclist team competing, and they're really overturning lots of stereotypes and prejudices about women and what women are capable of there. And I would love to be able to do that kind of thing elsewhere. In Egypt, for example, I mean, Egypt is one of the most conservative countries in the Middle East. And you get out of Cairo, and these are very repressive societies for women. Women absolutely are not allowed to ride bicycles at the moment. They can only go side saddle on motorbikes, because straddling things is seen, as somehow indecent. And to go into these smaller communities and perhaps to try and strengthen some of the NGO work that's already going on there, the local NGOs, would be, I think, a fantastic way to tap into these communities and help them. And there was a woman in a very small village in southern Egypt who had set up a women's rights NGO in very difficult conditions, and she'd done it with criticism from her family and from the male community, and her idea was just to build up women's financial independence slowly. And it was a tiny baby step, but very much in the right direction. And these little initiatives, I think, are perhaps the way forward, and you can kind of build these things from the ground up. And in Iran as well, I mean, I met women in Iran who talked about the country being a prison. Women's rights in Iran is in a dire state. They have to get permission from their male guardian to travel and leave the country and to get divorced, and all of these things. And I think probably something to do with bicycles for me as a cyclist and someone who's done this trip. I think that would probably be the area that I'd focus on if I tried to go down the activist route in these countries. I'm not quite sure what that will be yet, but hopefully watch this space, and and ideas would be very welcome as well in that respect.
Well, of all those countries you mentioned, Egypt and Iran, those so many countries that you visited, were those then just two of the countries that impacted you the most in terms of the reception you got, the takeaways, the treatment of women, or are there other countries there that surprised you in some way?
I think Egypt was something of a surprise, just the level of conservatism in society there. And I think just in the West, we sometimes don't realize quite how conservative it is, because Egypt is associated with holidays, with the Red Sea, with Cairo, and people don't realize that it's a vast country beyond that. And actually, I was surprised by the level of repression there that women have to face. And certainly that would be an area of focus for me. And Iran as well. Iran is much better documented in terms of the challenges that women face, but certainly, there's a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of women's rights there. So, I mean, they were two countries where I think I came away feeling that perhaps there were the biggest challenges, and is probably where I would focus my efforts. Sudan was another place, again, with a long way to go in terms of female equality, and faces very similar issues to Egypt, though I met some incredibly strong and impressive and independent women in Sudan who are running NGOs and are doing fantastic work out there. And again, I think for me, it would be probably a case of trying to ally myself with them and see what I could do to support the work that they're already doing. Certainly the idea of a woman on a bicycle comes as quite a big surprise to a lot of the communities that you end up cycling through in these places. And it's quite interesting, actually, the response from men, because I didn't really get any negative response from men at all on the trip, which was a surprise. In fact, they were excited by my trip, and they were incredibly interested and engaged by it. And for me, there was sometimes a sense of frustration that it seemed okay for me to be doing this because I was an outsider, a foreigner, a Western woman. Whereas if it had been often their sisters or their wives or their daughters wanting to do the same thing, then they may well have had an issue with that. And so there was occasionally this sense of double standard or hypocrisy regarding kind of attitudes to what I was doing. And I'd like to go some way to try and iron those out somehow, and to make people aware that, it's no different. There's no difference between, an outsider coming in and doing these sorts of things and local women doing exactly the same thing.
What about access for women to sport? Did you get a sense in any of those regions in the Middle East, particularly, Rebecca, of women's access and their participation in any sports while you were travelling through?
I think that women certainly, there were certain challenges in a lot of these places for women being involved in sports, and there are big differences between the capital cities of some of these countries and the smaller villages and communities, because in places like Cairo and Tehran, these are much more metropolitan, cosmopolitan places, and you do get women more involved in sports and cycling in particular. So in Cairo, I went out with a big cycling team there, a cycling community, and was surprised that a third of them were women. And there didn't really seem to be much issue with the women going along. And this was just one of many of these cycling groups that apparently operate in Cairo. And in Tehran as well, I met a number of female cyclists, although they did tend to cycle in the mountains and also very early on Friday mornings, which is when far fewer people would be on the road and were unlikely to see them, or the police were less likely to stop them, because that could be a problem in Iran in particular. So it just depended where you were. I mean, if you went outside the big cities, it was very, very different. I mean, the idea of women participating publicly in sports in the majority of Egypt outside Cairo, I think that's becomes much more problematic, and women have to cover themselves, certainly in Iran, and they have to cover their hair, they have to cover most of their skin, and so that creates problems just from a very pragmatic level of being able to go outside and practice sports. You have to do it in these confined, private, secure areas where people can't see you, or men can't see you or interact with you, and that does cause problems, and not just in those countries, but also, I mean, in the Gulf as well, in Oman and the UAE, there was certainly they tended to have segregated gyms, which is fine. I think that's probably what a lot of the women might have wanted, but that you didn't see many women on the streets running, jogging, playing sports. Like, it just wasn't really acceptable, and so I think that it's certainly I think it's a big challenge to make it more acceptable for women to be doing sports in a public venue. I think there's more acceptance of them doing it privately and behind closed doors. But to me, you asked the question, why? What's the difference between doing it in a social space and doing it in a private space?
Yeah, obviously there are challenges for them there, and I'm wondering also in the Eastern European countries too, where you travel through Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Albania, Serbia, Kosovo and Bulgaria. I'm just thinking of those before you got to the Middle East. Was there a sense there that women were more visible and more active in physical sport or physical activities, apart from working on the land, of course?
Yes, I think they were. I think so. I'm just trying to cast my mind back now. Some of these countries were so small that I only ended up staying a few days in each one. I think what's true actually in all of these countries, which is the same in the Middle East, is that, again, there's a big discrepancy between the capital cities and the boondocks surrounding it, the more remote areas, because I think it's certainly true that there's probably more connecting the capital cities of the world between them than there's connecting the capital cities of a country to some of the more remote areas. And so I think there was this disconnect. And so certainly I went through very deprived, very poor areas in Eastern Europe, Croatia, onwards through the Balkans. And some of these areas were, there were big issues with lack of equality between the sexes, and not a religious issue. And in the Middle East also, it's a combination of religion and culture. It's not purely to do with Islam by any stretch. And you certainly in Eastern Europe, you saw that these very backward communities, these communities, very poor communities, very deprived communities, where women were just as repressed as they were in many of the communities I went through in the Middle East, because, they simply haven't, equality simply hasn't got to the same level as it has in the more cosmopolitan areas. So I think everywhere, yes, in every community almost that I went through, that there was that disconnect between the cities and the more remote regions.
And there would have been some shocking visuals, as you described, about the Syrian refugee camp in Bulgaria, that being smuggled into that to see exactly what those living conditions were like. That's just an example. I mean, that must have been pretty shocking. It's writing about it from a distance is one thing, and seeing pictures, but actually walking through and breathing the air must have been pretty horrifying, Rebecca, wasn't it?
Well, certainly that refugee camp you just spoke about in Bulgaria was certainly a shock, I have to say. And it wasn't open to the public. As you mentioned, I was smuggled inside by one of the residents there, Syrian, Turkish dual national that I met. And the conditions were just horrific. I'm not quite sure what I expected, but it was incredibly unpleasant. I only had about 15 minutes in there before I had to get out, before it would have caused a problem. And it was the bathroom was flooded and dirty. The sinks were overflowing. It was rat infested. The bedrooms were overcrowded. They were dirty and mouldy. They had sort of 6 to 8 people to a very small room, and it's not surprising that a lot of these residents there were doing their best to get out as quickly as possible. Bulgaria didn't seem to put much care or consideration into their welfare, and and they were really keen to leave as quickly as possible and get to Europe, to Western Europe, to Germany, to Denmark, to the UK, and it, like you say, it's quite different when you report on this remotely and when you see it with your own eyes. And then I saw other refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan, and they, were equally shocking. I think I saw Syrian camps and Palestinian camps, and I think that actually, in a sense, the Palestinian camps, even though they were much better established because they'd been there for many decades, they were more shocking in a sense because they had been there for so long, and yet they were still of such poor quality, and they had these big, thick, overhanging electrical cables and water pipes all intermingled, which apparently were something of a death trap, and people were known regularly to be killed because of that. And there was issues with sewage, with huge overcrowding, very basic amenities. It's not a fun situation. And the Palestinians, unfortunately, have been forgotten really because of the Syrian crisis. And So it's the Syrian crisis is not just affecting the Syrians horrifically, but also having this knock-on effect as well for other groups, because attention is being drawn away. So it's it was a very affecting experience, I have to say, going to these places.
I'm sure, absolutely, and memories that will last a lifetime. And this is all because you decided to get on a bicycle and go and see it for yourself. And this must have been something for somebody who wasn't really active into sports, from what I gathered. It's not as if you were training for months for this, Rebecca. Had you been involved in any sports at all? I mean, what was your level of fitness before you got on that bike and decided to bike for 9 months?
Well, you're right. I didn't do much training for this trip beforehand. That was partly to do with laziness, I think. And because I felt that, I was going to be in the saddle for so many months that I'd just get fit as I went, and that would be more efficient. Although it actually took a lot longer than I was expecting in the end to get to that kind of requisite level of fitness where it wasn't just horrific every day. But I did do some sport before. I'm not completely unathletic. I'm certainly not a sports person by any stretch, but I cycle around London, I commute, and I used to commute to work and back every day. So that would be about 10 miles, although it's London miles, which is not real miles. So it's completely flat. And so I hadn't gone up a hill for a very, very long time. I'd gone up what I thought was a hill, but it turned out when I went on the trip that what I thought was a hill wasn't a hill at all. And so it was a very steep learning curve when I started. So I think I probably started with a certain base level of fitness, but I certainly wasn't fit enough to be doing this trip at the start, and that there was a few quite unpleasant weeks during a heat wave going through France at the beginning that were quite unhappy. So yes, if I did it again, maybe I'd do a little bit more work beforehand in retrospect.
Would you do a big adventure like this again? I mean, was there an intrepid adventure inside you waiting to come out, and this was your opportunity, and you would do it again somewhere else another time?
Yes, I think so. I think that's probably true to say. I'd been thinking about doing something like this for a long time, and I've done a few trips in the past. I enjoy traveling on my own. I mean, I enjoy traveling with people as well. I'm not a complete loner, but I do enjoy solo travel. And I'd done a Greyhound bus trip for a couple of months around America, and I sort of bus through Mexico and done the interrailing and done a few different little trips like that. And I'd cycled through Lebanon previously, which had given me a bit of the taste for cycling in the region. And I think part of it was that I did just want a big adventure, and I wanted to do it before I felt I needed to settle down. And I have a long-term boyfriend, and we live together in London. And I did feel that I'm in my mid-30s, that it would get to a point where I had more responsibilities and I wouldn't have this complete unfettered freedom that I have now to do whatever I want. And so I really felt that I had to kind of grasp that situation by the balls and just go out there and do it. And I wanted something that would really push me outside of my comfort zone and be really challenging physically, mentally, emotionally. And I also wanted to go to the Middle East because I was fascinated by the region. I felt that it was misrepresented. I was really interested to find out the truth about it on the ground. And so for me, all the pieces kind of fit together quite nicely in the end, and it seemed to work out quite well, fortunately. So would I do it again? Yes, I would. I mean, I'm probably getting. I would definitely do something like this again. I think probably not with the same freedom as I had before. And that was one of the things you asked me at the very beginning, like what some of my big takeaways of the trip were. And I think the realization that freedom is a real privilege and that not many people in the world have freedom. And to have the sort of freedom that I had to do this trip, the economic freedom, the social freedom, the political freedom as a woman, to be able to go out on my own on a bicycle and to be able to afford to do it, for my peers to accept that I was doing it, that I realize is a very precious thing and something that I really don't ever want to lose sight of, because most of the people that I met on the trip do not have that freedom. And that's a very sad situation, really. And it would be nice to try and change that somehow. But certainly, yeah, it was a joy for me personally to be able to do that.
So what would be your message to any women that are listening to this and thinking, gosh, that was really exciting, I would love to be brave enough to do that or have the resources to do it? What would you say to them, Rebecca?
I would say you don't have to be very brave to do it. I think people have this idea that it's a really scary world out there. And actually, I think as soon as you start dipping your toe into it, you realize it's actually not that scary after all. And so a good thing to do might be just to start small and build up, gradually build your confidence up until you are at the stage where you realize that actually it's okay to go out there, that most people, the vast majority of people, are nice, decent people who will empathize with you and look after you on a very human level, and that there isn't really as much as you might think from reading the media to be scared of. So I would certainly say that it would be a great idea, if you want to do this, to really throw yourself at it. Regarding having the resources to do it, you don't actually always need that many resources to do it. I mean, you can do these trips certainly on a bicycle really quite cheaply. I saved up quite a bit of money beforehand. I also had a mortgage to pay at home, which was probably my biggest outgoing. But there are ways. My budget was about between $10 and $20 I started working in during the trip a day, but I know people that have done it on much less than that. And certainly if you camp, I camped about half the trip, but if you camp much more than that, you can really cut down your expenses, and it could be a much more interesting trip for it. So I wouldn't let that get in your way either. So I guess, I would just wholeheartedly try and encourage people and women in particular to give it a shot.
Well, as you wrote earlier, the world is a kindlier place than it seems, and you have proved that, and you're going to include this story in your book that you're writing next. So when can we expect that, and what are you going to call it, Rebecca?
Well, it's probably early days for that. So I'm writing it at the moment, but I have an agent, but not a publisher yet. I only just started down that road, so I don't know when it would come out, but probably the year after next. Regarding the title, that's certainly a work in progress. I like, there's a particular Rumi poem which I like. I got quite into Rumi poetry when I was in Iran, and there's a quote that starts with the term "in ecstatic motion," and it's a phrase that I like. So I'm considering that as a working title, "in ecstatic motion," but we'll see. If anyone has got any ideas, then perhaps we can put it out to tender and see what people think.
That's a great idea, Rebecca. All right. Well, I know you're keeping busy with the pen anyway, continuing your journalism. We look forward to the book, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come on the program and tell us a little bit more about the insight and as a woman from that trip that you made. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
And you can find links in our show notes to Rebecca's website and her social media. That's all at wispsports.com, where you'll find more conversations from around the world of women's sports. With athletes and journalists from around the world, the WISP team brings you every perspective on women's issues in sports, whether in competition or off the field of play. You'll find blogs, articles, videos, and over 600 podcasts. They're all on the website at wispsports.com, and you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter at wispsports. We're also on Facebook, where you can join in the conversation by posting your comments, questions and suggestions. Or you can email us directly at info@wispsports.com. Until the next time, thank you for listening.